There are only 2 passages in the Hebrew Bible that mention the Nephilim by name, 2 brief sentences buried in the Torah that have haunted readers for thousands of years. Yet these few words sparked fear, speculation, and debate among ancient rabbis, early Christians, and medieval theologians alike. Who were the Nephilim? Why did hardened desert warriors panic at the thought of them? And if they were destroyed in the flood, why do they appear again centuries later in Canaan? To answer these questions, we need to trace the Nephilim from the primeval world before the flood, through the wilderness journeys of Israel, and into the hill country of Canaan, examining the historical, theological, and literary context that made these beings so terrifying. In doing so, we discover that the Nephilim were more than just giants. They were symbols of rebellion, chaos, and the very limits of human endurance in the face of divine authority. The story of the Nephilim begins in a world that had descended into unprecedented chaos and moral decay, a world where every thought and inclination of the human heart was only evil continually, as Genesis chapter 6 makes chillingly clear. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, took wives from among them, and produced offspring known as the Nephilim, described as mighty men and heroes of renown. But these were not merely impressive figures of strength or courage. They were embodiments of the consequences of rebellion against divine order, living reminders of a cosmos in which the natural boundaries between heaven and earth had been transgressed. The Hebrew term Hamas, often translated as violence, conveys more than simple physical aggression. It encompasses systemic oppression, pervasive injustice, and the kind of cruelty that corrodes societies from the inside out. By this point in human history, according to the biblical timeline, civilization had become so corrupt that the very earth itself seemed to groan in anticipation of divine judgment, and the Nephilim, as the product of these illicit unions, stood at the center of this growing chaos, a terrifying presence that would eventually necessitate the flood. Traditional chronologies situate this period approximately 1,656 years after the creation of Adam, which Archbishop James Ussher in the 17th century calculated to be around 2348 BCE, though other scholars suggest slightly different dates. Regardless of the precision, the narrative situates the Nephilim in an epoch in which humanity had reached a moral tipping point, and their existence functions as a literal and symbolic sign of the consequences of unchecked ambition and moral failure. The text implies that the Nephilim were extraordinary not only in physical stature, but in their capacity to wreak havoc across a world already teetering on the edge of divine wrath. Their presence signals a fusion of mortal and celestial rebellion, a hybrid threat whose very existence challenged the natural and divine order, illustrating the degree to which human society had deteriorated. They were, in essence, the embodiment of chaos made flesh, an unsettling fusion of human ambition and divine transgression. Elsewhere in Scripture, the term sons of God appears in the book of Job, chapters 1, 2, and 38, referring to celestial beings who present themselves before the Lord, rejoicing in the creation of the world and participating in divine deliberation. If Genesis chapter 6 uses the same meaning, then the Nephilim were not merely metaphorical giants, they were literal hybrids, born of the union of heavenly and human realms. Ancient readers of the text would have recognized the existential implications of such a reality. The Nephilim were not merely bodies of immense size, they were living challenges to the divine order, beings whose existence forced humans to confront boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Their terror lay as much in what they represented as in their physicality, a reminder of the fragility of moral and cosmic structure, the vulnerability of the human world when the natural order is violated, and the terrifying consequences that follow. Second Temple Jewish traditions amplify this terrifying picture. Texts like Jubilees, written around 150 BCE, and the Book of Giants, composed between 300 BCE and 100 BCE, expand the Genesis narrative, describing how the Nephilim spread violence, taught forbidden knowledge, and contributed to humanity's moral collapse. In these traditions, the Nephilim are not merely mythic curiosities, they are central to understanding why divine intervention, in the form of the flood, was necessary. These texts describe the giants teaching humans metallurgy, weapon-making, astrology, and other arts that, while impressive, were framed as corrupting influences leading to death, violence, and societal decay. In this context, The flood is not a punitive whim but a calculated divine response to a world destabilized by hybrid beings, a moral and cosmic reset designed to restore the boundaries that had been violated. The Nephilim thus serve both as historical memory and moral allegory, a terrifying reminder that transgression, whether human or angelic, has consequences that can reverberate across time. The flood itself represents the ultimate enforcement of divine justice. Unlike Mesopotamian myths in which gods fight primordial monsters to establish order, the Hebrew Bible portrays catastrophe as a moral and cosmic necessity, a cleansing of corruption rather than a struggle among divine beings. The Nephilim, in this framework, embody the extreme of transgression. They are both physical and moral threats, whose existence signals that order has been lost and must be restored. Their story teaches that extraordinary power without restraint, ambition without moral guidance, and rebellion against divine authority inevitably result in devastation. Ancient audiences, reading Genesis in the context of surrounding Mesopotamian literature, would have recognized the uniqueness of this moral framework, where divine judgment is both just and didactic, targeting the consequences of behavior rather than capriciously punishing arbitrary transgression. Genesis situates the Nephilim as the apex of a period of moral decay, making them both a narrative and theological pivot. They are the product of rebellion and the harbingers of destruction, representing a world teetering on the edge of collapse. By presenting them as the offspring of divine beings and humans, the text magnifies their role as symbols of transgression, warning of the dangers of overstepping boundaries that define creation itself. For the ancient audience, their presence would have been a terrifying reminder that the cosmic order is fragile and that even extraordinary power must submit to divine law. The Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6 serve as a bridge between history and moral, teaching, illustrating a recurring biblical theme. Extraordinary beings test human courage, obedience, and faith. They exist both as a historical memory of ancient terror and as allegorical figures, teaching timeless lessons about the dangers of rebellion, the fragility of moral order, and the necessity of divine oversight. Their story prepares the reader for the flood while establishing patterns that recur in Israelite encounters with giants in Canaan, ultimately reinforcing the lesson that power without divine guidance is inherently dangerous and that moral and cosmic boundaries are not to be crossed without consequence. The Watchers and the Book of Enoch. To truly understand the Nephilim, one must consider the Jewish traditions that expanded upon Genesis chapter 6, particularly during the Second Temple period, between 516 BCE and 70 CE. Among these, the Book of Enoch, composed between 300 BCE and 100 BCE, provides the most elaborate account, transforming the Nephilim from brief biblical figures into central actors in a cosmic drama. According to Enoch, a group of 200 angels known as the Watchers, led by the archangel Shemi-Haza, descended to Mount Hermon, which rises over 9,000 feet on the modern Lebanon-Syria border, and took human wives, pledging secrecy with oaths bound in blood. Their offspring were enormous giants, described as hundreds of cubits tall, a symbolic exaggeration meant to convey both physical and moral enormity. These beings wrought violence across the land, consuming everything humans produced, destroying livestock, and even turning to cannibalism, illustrating the absolute breakdown of social and moral order. The text emphasizes that these hybrid creatures were not only physically overwhelming, but morally catastrophic, corrupting the earth in ways that humanity alone could not repair. The Book of Enoch portrays the giants as a primary reason for the flood, linking their moral corruption directly to divine judgment. The narrative describes how the Watchers taught humans forbidden knowledge, including metallurgy, the use of weapons, and astrology, while women were instructed in cosmetics and seduction, all leading to societal destabilization. In doing so, the giants and their angelic progenitors blurred the lines between heaven and earth, human and divine, creating a world where chaos seemed unstoppable. The flood, in this framework, becomes both a corrective and preventative measure, a cosmic reset aimed at restoring balance to a universe destabilized by the Nephilim. This interpretation situates the Nephilim not only as historical or legendary beings, but as central moral actors, whose existence justified divine intervention on a global scale. The text further describes divine responses to this transgression. The archangel Raphael binds Azazel, the second in command among the Watchers, and Gabriel instructs the giants to destroy one another, demonstrating that transgression carries consequences even for beings of immense power. Their violence, previously unchecked, becomes self-destructive, emphasizing the principle that rebellion against God is ultimately fatal, no matter how mighty the transgressor. The Nephilim, therefore, function as a moral and cosmic lesson, showing that extraordinary power unmoored from divine law leads inevitably to destruction, a principle that resonates through subsequent biblical accounts of Israelite encounters with giants in Canaan. First, Enoch was highly influential among Jewish communities of the Second Temple period, especially the sects that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. These communities interpreted the story of the Watchers and Nephilim as a cautionary tale, a means of understanding the origins of evil, the necessity of obedience to God, and the inevitability of divine judgment. Within this milieu, the Nephilim were not relics of the distant past but symbols of ongoing moral and cosmic lessons. Their story functioned pedagogically, teaching that corruption, rebellion, and violence are inherently destabilizing and will provoke corrective action by God. The influence of Enochian traditions carried into early Christian thought as well. The Epistle of Jude references angels who did not keep their proper domain, and 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 speaks of angels cast into Tartarus, paralleling the punishment of the Watchers. These passages demonstrate that the Nephilim and their progenitors were understood as both historical memory and theological exemplars, warning against rebellion and illustrating the consequences of disobedience. The narrative also reinforces the continuity of divine justice, showing that the moral lessons embedded in the flood story extend to post-flood humanity and continue to shape spiritual understanding. Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, further contributes to this narrative by describing the sons of God as angels who begot sons of enormous strength and stature. He claims that in his time the bones of these giants could still be seen, demonstrating how legend and perceived historical evidence intertwined. Though modern archaeology does not corroborate the existence of such literal giants, the combination of cultural memory, monumental structures, and oral tradition helps explain why the Nephilim were remembered as extraordinary and terrifying beings. Their story reflects both human fascination with extraordinary power and the theological imperative to interpret it within a framework of moral and cosmic consequence. The Book of Enoch and related traditions situate the Nephilim at the intersection of history, legend, and theology. They are not merely impressive physical figures, but embodiments of the dangers of rebellion, the consequences of unrestrained power, and the moral necessity of divine oversight. By framing the Nephilim as both morally corrupt and cosmically significant, these texts ensure that their story continues to resonate, linking the antediluvian past to human experience in a manner that is both terrifying and instructive. Fear on the edge of Canaan. After centuries following the flood, the Israelites, under Moses' leadership, approached the land of Canaan, the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. Circa 1446 BCE. As recorded in Numbers chapter 13, Moses sent 12 spies to explore the territory, traveling through deserts and valleys, climbing the Judean hills, and surveying fortified cities such as Hebron, Debir, and Beersheba. It was there, in the hill country, that they reported encountering the Anakim, descendants of the Nephilim, described as formidable warriors of extraordinary height and strength. The spies confessed to overwhelming fear, stating, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we seemed to them," highlighting both the psychological impact and the perceived physical superiority of these clans. The terror they experienced was not mere exaggeration. It reflected a deeply ingrained cultural memory of a world in which giants once walked the earth, connecting post-flood Israel with the antediluvian past. Hebron, the focal point of the spies' report, was both strategically important and spiritually significant. It was later the site of David's first capital and the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Its prominence in the landscape, combined with the legends of giants inhabiting its hills, reinforced Israelite apprehension. Archaeology confirms that these regions were heavily fortified, with massive walls, gates, and towers designed to withstand formidable adversaries, lending credence to the spies' reports. The combination of tangible military threat and legendary memory created a perception of the Nephilim's descendants as virtually invincible, heightening Israel's sense of vulnerability and dependence on divine guidance. The Anakim, as described in Deuteronomy chapter 9, were people great and tall, striking fear into the hearts of all who saw them. Their reputation is amplified by the narrative to convey more than physical danger. They symbolize the persistence of disorder and moral challenge even after the flood. By framing the Anakim as descendants of the Nephilim, the biblical text connects the chaos of the antediluvian world with the post-flood reality, reminding Israel that the consequences of rebellion and moral collapse persist across generations. The Nephilim are not merely mythic giants, they are moral and psychological adversaries, teaching lessons about courage, obedience, and the human tendency to exaggerate threats when confronted with uncertainty. The spy's terror also reflects Israelite identity formation. By contrasting the Israelites' small stature and limited military experience with the overwhelming might of the Anakim, the narrative emphasizes the necessity of reliance on God. Success against these formidable opponents is presented as impossible by human means alone, requiring faith, obedience, and divine intervention. The Nephilim and their descendants, therefore, function as instruments of theological pedagogy, demonstrating that human courage is insufficient without spiritual alignment with God's plan. Later, rabbinic and midrashic interpretations expand upon the Anakim's connection to the Nephilim, suggesting that these clans carried with them the moral corruption of their antediluvian ancestors. The narratives portray them as not merely physically imposing but morally suspect, a reminder that power without righteousness is dangerous. Their presence also serves a narrative function, intensifying suspense and fear, dramatizing Israel's journey, and reinforcing the central biblical theme that divine assistance is essential to overcome extraordinary challenges. Archaeological remains of hilltop fortifications, megalithic structures, and monumental tombs in the region likely contributed to the legendary reputation of the Nephilim's descendants. Such structures, often far larger than what would be required for ordinary human defense, could easily inspire stories of giants inhabiting these sites. The interplay between memory, observation, and imagination created a cultural understanding in which the Nephilim were simultaneously historical, legendary, and symbolic, reflecting the complex relationship between perception and moral instruction in the biblical narrative. The Anakim serve as a bridge between pre-flood and post-flood history, connecting Israel's contemporary experience with the memory of ancient chaos. Their story illustrates how legends can shape cultural identity, instill moral lessons, and teach reliance on God. The fear of the Nephilim's descendants reinforces Israel's sense of purpose, courage, and humility, demonstrating that even extraordinary power is subordinate to divine order and human moral responsibility. Other giant clans and the Rephaim, the Nephilim, were not solitary figures. The Hebrew Bible mentions other giant clans, including the Rephaim, Emim, and Zamzumim, each occupying distinct territories and wielding extraordinary influence. Deuteronomy chapter 2 recounts how the Moabites displaced the Emim, describing them as great and tall like the Anakim, highlighting that these formidable clans were widespread in the ancient Near East. By situating the Nephilim alongside other giant groups, the biblical authors illustrate a recurring principle. Extraordinary physical power in human societies is frequently associated with moral danger, political dominance, and cultural disruption. These figures function both as historical analogues for formidable enemies and as symbolic representations of the chaos that results from human or supernatural rebellion. Among these clans, Og, king of Bashan, is perhaps the most famous. Circa 1400 BCE, as the Israelites advanced under Moses, they confronted Og's kingdom in the fertile Golan Heights. Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 11 records that Og's iron bed measured 9 cubits in length, roughly 13 feet, a detail likely meant to evoke awe and fear rather than serve as literal measurement. Nevertheless, archaeological evidence from the Golan Heights reveals monumental megalithic tombs and fortifications, suggesting that ancient populations constructed structures of imposing scale, potentially inspiring or reinforcing stories of giants. Og's defeat symbolizes divine intervention, demonstrating that even extraordinary physical power is ultimately subordinate to God's will. The Rephaim and other giant clans were also strategically significant. They controlled hilltop cities, fertile valleys, and trade routes, giving them military and economic advantage. Their dominance made them practical threats, not just legendary ones. In this context, the biblical emphasis on their size and strength amplifies the psychological impact of Israel's conquest and serves to elevate the necessity of divine assistance. By portraying these enemies as direct descendants or spiritual analogues of the Nephilim, the text links past rebellion with present challenges, reinforcing the moral dimension of warfare in Israelite thought. Later literary and prophetic texts further mythologize these clans. Isaiah chapter 14 verse 9 associates the Rephaim with the shades of the dead, suggesting that their legendary stature evolved into spiritual and symbolic memory. The Nephilim, in parallel, continue to function as symbols of disorder and cosmic rebellion. Their story underscores the enduring consequences of crossing divine boundaries and the repeated need for God's guidance to restore order, both physically and morally. Archaeological studies provide context for the persistence of giant legends. Hilltop fortifications, dolmens, and megalithic tombs across Canaan could easily have inspired oral traditions that exaggerated human size into tales of the Nephilim and Rephaim. The combination of tangible evidence, cultural memory, and imagination ensured that these giants remained embedded in collective consciousness, reinforcing moral and theological lessons about power, obedience, and divine authority. Thus, the Nephilim and other giant clans serve multiple functions. They are historical memory, moral cautionary figures, and literary devices. Their story connects the chaos of the antediluvian world to the post-flood experience of Israel, illustrating that extraordinary power without moral restraint is inherently unstable. By situating them within historical, geographical, and theological contexts, the biblical narrative demonstrates the persistent consequences of rebellion and the necessity of divine guidance. The Rephaim, Emim, and Anakim emphasize Israelite dependence on God. Their narrative reinforces a central biblical principle: even beings of extraordinary strength are ultimately subordinate to divine will. The giant's memory serves to teach faith, humility, and the consequences of disobedience, demonstrating that moral and spiritual vigilance is as critical as military or physical prowess in navigating a dangerous and complex world. Second Temple Judaism and early Christian thought. The Second Temple period, spanning 516 BCE to 70 CE, saw Jewish scholars and scribes expand upon the story of the Nephilim, transforming brief mentions in Genesis into a complex narrative that shaped theology, ethics, and eschatology. Texts like Jubilees, composed around 150 BCE, retold Genesis with a particular focus on the sons of God, the Watchers, and the moral corruption that necessitated the flood. In these works, the Nephilim are presented not only as historical figures but as moral exemplars, demonstrating the consequences of rebellion and the dangers of illicit knowledge. Their story was central to communities like Qumran, where copies of First Enoch were preserved, showing that these narratives were foundational to understanding the origins of evil and the necessity of divine justice. Early Christian writings also engaged with these traditions. The Epistle of Jude references angels who did not keep their proper domain, a direct parallel to the Watchers described in Enoch, while 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 recounts their punishment, illustrating the continuity of theological reflection on the Nephilim. In this context, these beings symbolize spiritual disorder as well as physical threat, demonstrating that divine justice addresses both moral corruption and cosmic imbalance. The Nephilim thus operate as both historical memory and moral allegory, reinforcing the idea that extraordinary power, if misused, carries inevitable consequences. Josephus, writing around 93 CE, contributes to the historical dimension by describing the sons of God as angels, who begot sons of remarkable size and strength, claiming that their bones could still be seen in his time. While modern archaeology has not verified such claims, the tradition illustrates how legend and perceived historical evidence were intertwined. Tales of the Nephilim reinforced moral and theological lessons, demonstrating that rebellion against God, whether by humans or supernatural beings, is ultimately self-destructive and subject to divine correction. Second Temple and early Christian texts also situate the Nephilim in eschatological narratives, framing them as part of the cosmic struggle between order and chaos. Their story links moral transgression with divine judgment, showing that the consequences of rebellion persist across generations and that extraordinary power is insufficient without obedience to God. The Nephilim become archetypes, teaching communities about the enduring principles of divine justice, human limitation, and moral vigilance. The pedagogical function of these narratives is significant. Communities were reminded that even beings of extraordinary strength are powerless before divine authority, and that moral collapse has far-reaching consequences. The Nephilim serve as a cautionary tale, teaching lessons about humility, restraint, and the spiritual dangers of ambition divorced from righteousness. Their story continues to influence theological and ethical reflection across both Jewish and Christian traditions. The Second Temple period and early Christian thought solidified the Nephilim as central symbols of rebellion, moral corruption, and cosmic imbalance. By framing them as both historical and allegorical figures, these texts reinforce the lessons embedded in Genesis and the flood narrative, demonstrating the persistent consequences of transgression and the necessity of divine oversight. The Nephilim remain enduring reminders of the dangers of extraordinary power misapplied and the enduring need for moral vigilance. Did the Nephilim survive the flood? Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 introduces a tantalizing ambiguity, stating that the Nephilim appeared on the earth both before and after the flood, leaving scholars and readers to wonder whether any of these beings survived or if the term was reused symbolically. Rabbinic tradition offers imaginative possibilities, such as remnants of giants clinging to the ark or descendants persisting through intermarriage, though these accounts are largely legendary. More plausibly, the post-flood references to Nephilim, such as the Anakim in Canaan, represent symbolic or cultural continuity rather than literal survival. Ancient writers often employed the memory of extraordinary beings to describe human populations that exhibited remarkable height, strength, or martial prowess, amplifying their reputation through the lens of legend and divine narrative. By linking the Anakim to the pre-flood Nephilim, the biblical text maintains continuity, emphasizing that moral and cosmic consequences persist across generations, and that extraordinary power without divine approval remains dangerous. Joshua chapter 11 verse 21 recounts how Joshua, leading Israel's conquest of Canaan circa 1400 BCE, systematically cut off the Anakim from the hill country, leaving only remnants in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. These territories would later become the setting for Goliath, a warrior whose size and strength echo the legendary stature of the Nephilim. 1 Samuel chapter 17 describes Goliath as nearly 10 feet tall, a detail likely meant to convey intimidation as much as literal measurement. Archaeology in the region supports the impression of monumental construction and fortification, with massive stone walls and megalithic tombs suggesting that ancient communities valued size, strength, and endurance, both materially and culturally. Such structures may have reinforced the legend of giants, ensuring that the Nephilim remained vivid in collective memory, even centuries after the flood. The reappearance of Nephilim-like figures serves a psychological and theological purpose. The Israelites, facing enemies of extraordinary strength, are reminded that courage alone is insufficient and that reliance on God's guidance is essential. Fear of giants emphasizes human limitations and creates narrative tension, illustrating a pattern in which extraordinary physical power, if unchecked, cannot challenge divine will. The post-flood Nephilim become instruments of moral and spiritual teaching, embodying the persistence of chaos and the enduring consequences of rebellion against divine law. This continuity also reinforces the biblical theme of moral vigilance. Even after humanity has been purged of corruption through the flood, remnants of the past, whether symbolic or literal, serve as reminders that moral failure and rebellion have consequences that echo across generations. The Nephilim, through their descendants or memory, challenge Israel to maintain faith, obedience, and courage, demonstrating that human strength, strategy, and intellect alone are insufficient to secure survival or victory. Ancient memory and archaeological evidence provide context for these narratives. Fortified hilltop cities, monumental tombs, and evidence of large-scale construction in Canaan would have impressed and intimidated Israelite observers, reinforcing stories of giants. The Nephilim, therefore, are a fusion of historical perception, legendary amplification, and theological purpose, teaching that extraordinary strength must always be subject to divine authority. Finally, whether or not any Nephilim survived physically is less important than their enduring symbolic and moral presence. Their story bridges the antediluvian and post-flood worlds, connecting cosmic rebellion to earthly challenges and demonstrating that extraordinary power, if misused, invites inevitable judgment. The Nephilim remain both a historical memory and a moral archetype, warning that defiance of God carries consequences that endure across centuries and civilizations. The theological legacy of the Nephilim serve as enduring symbols of rebellion, chaos, and the consequences of transgressing divine boundaries. Their story frames the flood and Israel's later conquest of Canaan as triumphs of divine order over disorder, demonstrating that extraordinary power divorced from righteousness inevitably leads to destruction. Unlike myths in Mesopotamia, where gods fought monsters to establish order, the Hebrew Bible emphasizes moral causality. Chaos and corruption arise from disobedience, and divine intervention restores balance. The Nephilim embody this principle, representing both physical and moral threats that illustrate the dangers of crossing sacred limits. They are terrifying not because of size alone, but because they reveal what happens when the natural and moral order collapses, blending cosmic rebellion with human vulnerability. From the spy's report in Numbers chapter 13 to the legendary stature of Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, the Nephilim demonstrate the limits of human strength and the necessity of faith. Their presence, whether historical or symbolic, amplifies Israelite dependence on God, highlighting that victory against overwhelming forces requires obedience, courage, and divine guidance. They function as pedagogical tools, teaching moral and spiritual lessons through narrative drama, demonstrating that the consequences of rebellion are both immediate and long-lasting. Rabbinic interpretations and early Christian writings continue to expand on this legacy. Fallen angels, giants, and mighty warriors are consistently portrayed as examples of divine judgment, showing that extraordinary physical or spiritual power is irrelevant when moral law is violated. The Nephilim exemplify a recurring biblical pattern. Power alone cannot achieve righteousness, and moral transgression invites inevitable consequences. Their story links the primeval past with historical memory, shaping theological reflection and providing enduring lessons on human limitations. The Nephilim also illustrate the ancient understanding of cause and effect in the divine-human relationship. Catastrophe is never random. The flood was a response to systemic corruption, and the descendants of Nephilim in Canaan served as living reminders of moral vigilance. These narratives teach that extraordinary beings, no matter how formidable, cannot escape judgment, emphasizing the necessity of humility, restraint, and adherence to divine authority. By blending historical, legendary, and theological dimensions, the Nephilim embody principles that resonate across generations. Even in modern thought, the Nephilim continue to fascinate because they merge history, myth, and moral instruction. Their terrifying reputation blending physical enormity, moral corruption, and cosmic significance serves as a cultural and spiritual touchstone. They are cautionary figures, reminding readers that rebellion against God carries consequences beyond immediate perception and that moral and cosmic order must always be respected. The Nephilim's legacy lies in their role as moral and spiritual exemplars. They teach that unchecked ambition, rebellion against divine authority, and extraordinary power without restraint are inherently dangerous. By confronting humans with figures of immense strength and moral corruption, the biblical narrative demonstrates the necessity of faith, humility, and obedience, making the Nephilim central to the moral and theological imagination of Israel and early Christian communities. The Nephilim are more than giants. They are symbols of cosmic rebellion, human vulnerability, and the enduring consequences of defiance against divine law. Their presence, from Genesis to Israel's conquest of Canaan, illustrates a continuous thread of moral instruction, reminding humanity that extraordinary power, if divorced from righteousness, is ultimately self-destructive and always subject to divine judgment. Their story is terrifying, timeless, and profoundly instructive, bridging history, legend, and theology in a manner that continues to resonate across millennia.